London, July 1974. The Palladium is sold out for the second night running. Cass Elliot walks to the microphone in a sequined gown, and the audience rises before she sings a single note. The reviews the next morning will call it a triumph. One critic writes that she has never sounded better. Another says she seemed finally at ease. 4 days later, she is dead. She is 32 years old. The cause of death is heart failure. The story that travels around the world is something else entirely. A sandwich, a joke, a punchline that requires no grief and no reckoning. It spreads because it fits something people already believed about her. It will take decades to correct, and by then it will have already done its work. What follows is not a story about a tragic death or a stolen career, though both of those things are present. It is a story about a woman who spent her entire life negotiating for the right to be taken seriously in rooms that had already decided what she was for. The negotiation was relentless, often invisible, and largely unsuccessful. She was immensely talented. She was, by any measure, successful. She was also, by almost every account, profoundly alone in ways that success did not reach. That distance between what the world saw and what it cost is where this story lives. Ellen Naomi Cohen was born on September 19, 1941 in Baltimore, Maryland, the first child of Philip and Bess Cohen. Philip ran a delicatessen. The neighborhood was working-class Jewish, post-war, striving, a place where respectability was something you maintained carefully, where what the neighbors thought carried real weight, and where a loud, oversized girl who wanted to perform was not exactly what the family had in mind. She was, by all accounts, large from the beginning, not just in body, though that would become the organizing fact of how the world described her, but in presence. She sang around the house constantly. She memorized radio programs. She did impressions of people she had just met. Her brother Leah would later say that Cass never seemed to have an internal volume dial. Whatever she felt came out. Her father, Philip, was a man of appetites himself, warm, gregarious, someone who told stories and held a room. Cass inherited this from him directly, but Philip's diner failed, and then another business venture failed after that, and the family moved from Baltimore to Alexandria, Virginia, and then again the particular rootlessness of a household where the income was never quite stable. Cass was enrolled in new schools with a frequency that meant she was always the new girl, always the one who had to establish herself quickly or disappear into the back of the class. She chose not to disappear. At George Washington High School in Alexandria, she auditioned for every production the drama department mounted. She got roles, not the ingenue roles. Those went to the girls the teachers cast without hesitation, but supporting parts, comic parts, the kind of roles that required someone willing to be looked at in a particular way. She played them with a commitment that her classmates remembered long afterward. One friend from that period recalled that Cass didn't just learn her lines. She learned everyone else's too, in case someone dropped out and she was needed. She was always preparing for the chance that something might open up. Her relationship to her own body was established in these years, in the specific and grinding way that adolescence establishes such things. She was not thin, and the culture she was growing up in had very little ambiguity about what that meant for a girl. The 1950s did not deal in nuance on this subject. Department stores had a section called Pretty Plus. Doctors prescribed amphetamines to teenage girls as a matter of routine. The message was consistent, and it came from everywhere. From her mother, who worried, from her classmates, who were cruel in the ordinary ways, from the television she watched, which did not contain anyone who looked like her in any role she was supposed to want. What she did with that, at least outwardly, was perform her way past it. She became funny. She became the girl who got there first with the joke, who named the thing before anyone else could use it against her. This is a familiar strategy, and it worked in the limited way such strategies work. It got her through the room, but it did not change what the room thought of her when she wasn't performing. She graduated in 1959 and did what young people with theatrical ambitions and no particular plan did in that era. She went to New York. The New York she arrived in was in the middle of a folk revival that was reshaping what popular music could look like. Washington Square Park on a Sunday afternoon was full of people with guitars and strong opinions about authenticity. The coffee houses in the village were booking anyone who could hold an audience for 20 minutes. It was, in theory, a scene that valued talent over image, rawness over polish, the real over the manufactured. In practice, it was not quite that simple. Cass moved into a series of shared apartments in the village, taking waitressing work and acting auditions and showing up at open mics with the same relentless availability she had shown in high school. She fell into the orbit of a loose collective of young musicians and actors, people who would eventually become significant figures in the folk and rock world. She was liked. She was entertaining. She was, as she had always been, useful in a room. What she was not, in the eyes of the men who ran that scene, was a romantic prospect or a serious artist. These two things were connected in ways that were not openly stated, but were felt immediately by anyone paying attention. The women who got taken seriously in folk circles in the early 1960s tended to look a certain way. Joan Baez, Judy Collins. The aesthetic was ethereal, delicate, unthreatening. Cass was none of those things, and she knew it, and she watched it operate against her in real time. She auditioned for a role in the original Broadway production of The Music Man and did not get it. She auditioned for other productions and did not get those either. The rejections accumulated in the particular way they do when a person is talented enough to get into the room but defined before they open their mouth. What kept her going, by her own account in later interviews, was the singing itself. She had a voice that was, even in these early years, striking in a way that cut through the room. It was warm, effortless sounding in the way that only rigorous naturals sound effortless, and it had a quality that producers and musicians would later struggle to describe precisely, something about the way it sat in the air after she stopped. A pianist who accompanied her at an open mic in 1961 told a journalist years later that he had heard a lot of people sing, and that Cass was one of perhaps 3 he had encountered whose voice made him stop thinking about anything else. She was 20 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 other women, making $40 a week when the work came in. She had not recorded anything. She had not been offered a record deal or a regular booking or a manager who believed in her. She had been told, in various ways and by various people, that the industry she wanted to enter had a place for her voice, but not for her body, and that this was simply the way things were, and that she might consider whether television commercials or backup singing might be a more realistic goal. She did not consider it, or if she did, she set the consideration aside. She kept showing up. By 1962, Cass had been in New York long enough to understand its taxonomies. The folk scene sorted people quickly and without much ceremony into those who were being watched and those who were watching. She had settled, without anyone announcing it formally, into the second category. She was in the rooms. She was not on the stages that mattered. She had joined a group called the Big Three that year, alongside Tim Rose and James Hendricks. The name was straightforward. 3 voices, folk arrangements, the kind of harmonically clean sound that was working well for acts like Peter, Paul, and Mary. They played the village coffee houses, they recorded an album for FM records, and they toured in the modest way that folk acts toured in that period. Station wagons, motels, college campuses in the Northeast, where audiences were enthusiastic and the pay was not. The group was functional. It was not a success in any way that changed the trajectory of its members, but it gave Cass something she had not had before, a format in which her voice could be heard against other voices, and in which the specific quality of what she did became audible by contrast. Harmony singing is relational. It only fully exists in the presence of other sounds, and Cass discovered in this period that she had an almost architectural understanding of where her voice needed to go to complete a chord. She did not need to be told. She heard it. Tim Rose, who was not an easy collaborator by most accounts, later acknowledged that Cass's ear was the most reliable thing in the group. She could find the harmony on a song she had never heard before the count-in. This is not a common ability, and the people who worked with her in these years consistently noted it. What they less consistently noted was that she was not being compensated or credited in proportion to her contribution. This was not unusual for the period, and not unusual for women in folk groups specifically. The arrangement was informal, and the informality worked against her. There were no written agreements about royalties or songwriting credit. There was an assumption, largely unexamined, that certain members of a group were the creative center, and others were the supporting structure. Cass was the supporting structure. She filled the sound out. She made the harmonies land. And when the group dissolved in 1963, she had a year of touring experience, a minor recording credit, and no money. She was 22. What she had accumulated, more than anything else, was a network. The folk scene was small enough that everyone knew everyone after a certain point, and Cass knew people. She was the person you called when you needed a fourth voice for a session, or when a gig needed filling and the original act had canceled. She was reliable, she was professional, and she did not make scenes about being underpaid or underused. Or if she did, she made them privately. In 1963, she met Denny Doherty, a Canadian singer from Halifax who had come to New York with a group called the Halifax Three. Denny was charming in the specific way of people who have been charming since childhood and have never needed to develop anything underneath it. He was handsome in a way the era rewarded. He and Cass became close quickly, the kind of close that in retrospect looks like the beginning of something, but which, at the time, was understood by at least one of them as friendship and by the other as something less categorizable. Cass was in love with Denny Doherty. This is not a contested fact. She said so herself in interviews with a frankness that was characteristic of her and that the interviewers often did not know what to do with. She said it without performing heartbreak, which somehow made it worse to hear. She loved him, and he did not love her back in the same way, and she stayed near him anyway, because the alternative was to leave, and leaving was not something she was practiced at. This dynamic, Cass as the person whose feelings were acknowledged and then set aside, the person who was wanted in the room, but not in the way she wanted to be wanted, would repeat throughout her life with a consistency that suggests it was not accidental. She had learned, somewhere in the years between Baltimore and New York, to make herself indispensable in the ways that were available to her. Her voice, her humor, her ability to hold a group together socially, to smooth tensions, to be the person who knew where everyone stood and managed the distances between them. These were real skills, and she deployed them constantly. They were also a way of staying close to people who were not going to choose her. In 1964, Denny Doherty joined a group called the Mugwumps alongside Zal Yanofsky and John Sebastian, who would later form the Lovin' Spoonful, and a young woman named Michelle Gilliam. Cass was not initially in the Mugwumps. She was again adjacent. She came to rehearsals. She sang along informally. She was present in the way she had learned to be present, available, useful, not quite included. The Mugwumps recorded an album for Warner Brothers that was shelved and not released until years later. The group dissolved in 1965, and in the dissolution, something shifted. John Phillips had arrived in New York with Michelle, who was by then his wife. Phillips was a songwriter of genuine ability and considerable ego, the kind of person who organized rooms around himself without appearing to try. He had ideas about what a group could sound like. Something bigger than folk, more produced, influenced by the California sound that was beginning to emerge from the radio. He was looking for voices. Cass wanted in. What happened next has been told in various ways by the people involved, and the versions do not entirely agree. What is consistent across all of them is that Cass inserted herself into the equation through sheer persistence. She showed up. She sang. She made herself impossible to exclude without actively excluding her, which required a kind of deliberate cruelty that even John Phillips, who was capable of deliberate cruelty, did not want to perform in public. She got in, but the terms of her entry were set in those first weeks, in the way terms always are. Quietly, without being written down, in the assumptions that accumulate before anyone thinks to question them. In the winter of 1965, John Phillips, Michelle Phillips, Denny Doherty, and Cass Elliot traveled to the Virgin Islands. The trip was not a vacation in any conventional sense. It was a drift. The kind that happens when a group of people in their mid-20s have no money, no immediate obligations, and a loose belief that something is about to happen for them if they can just stay together long enough. They lived on a boat called the Yarmouth Castle for several weeks. The conditions were uncomfortable. There was not enough money for food on certain days. John and Michelle's marriage was already under a strain that would only deepen. Michelle had begun sleeping with Denny Doherty. a fact that John either did not know or chose not to confront directly during this period. Cass was aware of it. She was aware of most things that happened in the emotional atmosphere of any group she was part of. Awareness was one of her primary tools. What happened in the Virgin Islands musically was that the four of them began to sing together seriously for the first time. Not at rehearsals, not at open mics, but in the close and unguarded way that happens when people are living on top of each other with nothing else to do. John had been writing songs. He had a harmonic instinct that was sophisticated for pop music of that moment. He understood how to layer voices in ways that created texture rather than just volume. And when Cass's voice entered the arrangements he was building, something happened that had not happened without her. She completed them. This was audible to everyone present, including John Phillips, who did not want it to be true and could not pretend it wasn't. He had not wanted Cass in the group. The reasons for this were never stated directly in public, but they were not difficult to read. She did not fit the image he was constructing. The Mamas and the Papas, as the group would become, was built around a particular visual logic. Two beautiful couples. California sun, the suggestion of an effortless and attractive life. Cass disrupted this logic simply by existing. She knew this. She had always known it. What she had calculated correctly was that her voice would make the disruption worth tolerating. The group returned to the mainland and made their way to California, where John had secured an introduction to Lou Adler, who ran Dunhill Records. Adler was a producer with a clean commercial instinct and an ability to hear what a radio audience would want before the radio audience knew it wanted it. He listened to the group sing in his office and signed them almost immediately. The sessions for what would become If You Can Believe Your Eyes and Ears began in late 1965. In the studio, the hierarchy established itself without discussion. John Phillips wrote the songs and directed the arrangements. He decided what each voice did and where. This was not unusual for a songwriter-led group, and his instincts in the studio were genuinely good. But the structure meant that Cass's contributions, her harmonic choices, the adjustments she made in real time that improved what was on the page, were absorbed into the final product without attribution. The records sounded the way they sounded partly because of decisions she made in the moment. Those decisions were not credited as decisions. They were treated as the natural output of a voice being correctly deployed. The album was released in January 1966. California Dreamin' had already been released as a single in December 1965 and was climbing the charts. By the spring of 1966, the Mamas and the Papas were famous. Fame arrived with a specific shape. The press coverage of the group established its visual grammar immediately and did not deviate from it. John and Michelle were photographed as a couple. Denny Doherty was photographed as the handsome one, the charmer. Cass was photographed as the funny one, the personality, the woman whose presence required some explanation, that her talent alone was not considered sufficient to provide. Interviewers asked her about her weight in the first or second question with a regularity that was, by any measure, extraordinary. She answered these questions. She made jokes. She performed ease with a skill that was, in its own way, as impressive as anything she did in the studio. Behind this, the internal dynamics of the group were deteriorating in the particular way of groups built on unstable personal foundations. Michelle and Denny's affair continued. John's response to it was oblique and controlling. He did not confront it directly, but rearranged the group's logistics in ways that created pressure without naming the source. Cass remained close to Denny, which meant she was positioned in the middle of a triangle that had no good position to occupy. She knew what was happening between Michelle and Denny. She said nothing publicly, whatever she felt about it, and she was in love with Denny. This had not changed. She contained. In 1966, Michelle was briefly fired from the group. The official reason given was that she had missed rehearsals and was behaving unprofessionally. The real architecture of the situation was more complicated. John's anger about the affair, the group's internal tensions, and the question of what the Mamas and the Papas were now that they were famous, and the original terms of their arrangement were being renegotiated by success. Cass did not publicly take sides. She gave interviews during this period in which she was careful, diplomatic, and warm about everyone involved. She understood with the precision of someone who had spent years surviving by being indispensable that taking sides was a way of becoming expendable. If she aligned with John, she lost Denny. If she aligned with Michelle, she lost John, and John controlled the music. She stayed in the middle and said the right things and kept singing. Michelle was reinstated after a matter of weeks. The public version of events presented the whole episode as a minor disruption, already resolved. The group released Monday in the spring of 1966. It went to #1. The machine kept moving. Cass kept her place in it, and the terms established in that first winter, that her voice was essential and her presence was conditional, held. By the summer of 1966, the Mamas and the Papas were among the most commercially successful acts in American popular music. Their records were on every radio station. Their faces were on every magazine. They were invited to parties in Bel Air and photographed on yachts and written about in the kind of language that the music press reserved for people it had decided were important. Lou Adler was pleased. Dunhill Records was pleased. The machinery of the industry had found them useful and was using them fully. Cass was making more money than she had ever seen. She moved into a house in Laurel Canyon, the hillside neighborhood above Hollywood, where musicians and writers had begun to congregate in the particular way that happens when a scene is forming and no one has yet named it. The house was large. She filled it with people, friends, musicians passing through, people who needed a place to stay, people who simply liked being where the conversation was good and the food was plentiful. She was, by all accounts, a generous and instinctive host. Her home became a place where the social life of the canyon collected and redistributed itself. This was not accidental. She had always organized herself around people, had always made herself the center of a social gravity that she could not always be the center of professionally. The house in Laurel Canyon was a continuation of what she had been doing since high school, building a room she belonged in, because the rooms that already existed were not quite right. In public, the year was a series of television appearances, profile pieces, and performances. The group appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. They performed at festivals. They gave interviews in hotel rooms where journalists arrived with prepared questions and a general framework for who the Mamas and the Papas were supposed to be, and Cass consistently did not fit the framework and was consistently asked to account for it. The question of her body came up in nearly every significant interview she gave during this period. Not always crudely. Sometimes it was framed as concern, sometimes as curiosity, sometimes as a kind of backhanded acknowledgement that she had succeeded despite something. The despite was always present. A profile in a major music publication in 1966 described her voice as improbably beautiful. The adverb doing quiet damage in a single word. Another piece called her the group's secret weapon, a phrase that managed to compliment and diminish simultaneously, positioning her talent as something unexpected rather than something earned. She read these pieces. She responded to them in interviews with humor and apparent equanimity. She said, in various formulations, that she had learned not to let it bother her. The consistency with which she said this, the smoothness of the delivery, the readiness of the answer, suggests that she had been asked so many times that the response had become automatic, which is different from it being true. Within the group, the dynamics that had been established in the Virgin Islands were now operating under the pressure of fame. John Phillips remained the creative authority. His word on arrangements, on set lists, on the direction of their recordings was final in practice, if not always in name. He was also, in this period, consuming increasing amounts of drugs. The particular combination of amphetamines and hallucinogens that the canyon scene ran on, and his behavior was becoming less predictable. He could be generous and then withholding. He could praise a performance in the studio and then spend an hour rearranging it in a way that reduced its most distinctive elements. Cass had a specific experience of this. There are accounts, drawn from later interviews she gave and from memoirs written by people present at the sessions, of moments in the studio where her instinctive harmonic choices were overridden by Phillips for reasons that were not purely musical. A former session musician who worked on their 1967 recordings told a journalist years later that he had watched Phillips redirect Cass's vocal line on multiple occasions, pulling her back from arrangements that were, in his assessment, better than what replaced them. The musician's interpretation was that Phillips was managing something other than sound in those moments. What exactly he was managing, ego, control, the visual logic of the group's identity, was not stated, but the pattern was consistent enough to be a pattern. What Cass did in response was absorb it. She did not in this period make ultimatums or walk out of sessions. She adjusted, renegotiated within the available space, and delivered what was asked of her with a professionalism that the people who worked with her uniformly described as remarkable. She was not passive. She pushed back. She made her case. She argued for her choices with specific musical reasoning. But she did not push to the point of rupture because rupture would have cost her the thing she had fought so hard to get into. In 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival took place in June. It was, in retrospect, one of the definitional events of that cultural moment. 3 days of performances that established which acts the new rock audience was going to take seriously. The Mamas and the Papas performed on the final night. John Phillips had been involved in organizing the festival, which gave him a particular authority over its shape. Their performance was polished and well received. Cass, watching from the wings or the audience during the other acts, was seen by multiple people as visibly moved by what she was hearing. Janis Joplin performed at Monterey. So did Otis Redding and Jimi Hendrix and The Who. These were performances that operated at a different emotional register than what the Mamas and the Papas were built to deliver. Rawer, less arranged, closer to something that could not be managed in a studio. She talked about Janis Joplin's performance afterward with something that people who heard her describe it remembered as more than admiration. The specific thing she said in different versions across different accounts was some variation of the observation that Joplin got to be exactly what she was, without negotiation. The group released Dedicated to the One I Love in the spring of 1967. It went to number 2. The year was, by any commercial measure, another success. Cass was 25 years old. She had been famous for less than 2 years. The weight of maintaining her position, the specific labor of being simultaneously essential and apologized for, had already been going on longer than that. On July 29, 1974, Cass Elliot was found dead in a flat in Mayfair, London. She was 32 years old. The flat belonged to Harry Nilsson, who had lent it to her for the duration of her London engagement. The housekeeper who found her called for an ambulance. By the time it arrived, there was nothing to be done. The autopsy was conducted by Keith Simpson, one of Britain's most experienced forensic pathologists. His findings were unambiguous. Cass Elliot died of heart failure, specifically fatty myocardial degeneration, a condition in which fat accumulates in the heart muscle and compromises its function. There was no food in her throat. There was no obstruction of any kind. She had not choked. She had gone to sleep, and her heart had stopped. This is what the record shows. It is not what most people were told. Within hours of her death, before the autopsy had been completed, before any official cause had been determined, a story began circulating in the press. The story was that she had choked on a ham sandwich. Some versions specified that the sandwich was found half-eaten on the nightstand. Some versions added details about the type of bread. The story moved through wire services and into newspapers and onto television news with a speed that the actual facts, released quietly days later, could not match. No ham sandwich was found at the scene. This detail does not appear in any official report, any police record, or any statement from the medical examiner. Keith Simpson, in his own account of the case written years afterward, addressed the story directly and dismissed it. There was no sandwich. There was no choking. The cause of death was a heart condition that had been present and unaddressed for some time. The story persisted anyway. It persisted because it was useful, not in any coordinated or deliberate way. There was no meeting at which someone decided to replace a medical fact with a grotesque image. It persisted because it fit a prior narrative so neatly that the people receiving it did not stop to question whether it was true. A fat woman who loved food had eaten herself to death. The story required no further explanation because it confirmed what had already been decided about her. This is the mechanism worth examining, not the story itself. The ham sandwich is a small and obvious lie. What it rested on was something larger and longer, a decade of coverage, of interviews, of profile pieces and television appearances, and casual remarks by bandmates and industry figures that had established Cass Elliot's body as the primary fact about her. Before her voice, before her harmonic ear, before her social intelligence or her business instincts, or the specific quality of warmth that made people in her presence feel, repeatedly, that they were the most interesting person in the room. Her body was the first thing mentioned, and often the last. The sandwich story was the final iteration of this. Death as confirmation, the body as its own conclusion. She had spent her adult life trying to control the narrative around this. She had made the jokes before the journalists could. She had answered the questions about her weight with patience and humor, across hundreds of interviews, deploying a practiced ease that cost her something each time. In 1972, she told a reporter from Rolling Stone that she had learned to separate what she weighed from what she was worth, and said it with enough conviction that the reporter printed it without apparent irony. Whether she believed it or whether it was one more performance of equanimity is not something the record can settle. What the record does show is that she had been told, repeatedly and from multiple directions, that her body was a problem to be managed. Her doctors had told her this, the industry had told her this, her bandmates had told her this in the particular way that people tell each other things without quite saying them. Through jokes that land slightly too hard, through the visual logic of album covers and promotional photographs in which she is positioned slightly apart, slightly angled, the arrangement just different enough from the others to register subliminally. She had dieted throughout her adult life with the particular desperation of someone who understands that the dieting is not really for her health. There are accounts of crash diets in the mid-1960s of amphetamine use that was common in the music industry of that period and carried specific risks for someone with an underlying cardiac condition. Whether anyone who was prescribing or supplying those drugs knew about the cardiac vulnerability is not clear. Whether they would have changed their behavior if they had known is a question the record does not answer. Her heart condition was, in retrospect, detectable. Fatty myocardial degeneration does not appear without warning. It develops over years. It produces symptoms: fatigue, shortness of breath, a heaviness that the person carrying it might easily attribute to other causes, especially if those other causes have been consistently offered to them as explanations for everything their body does. She had been tired for years. She had pushed through performances when her body was telling her something. The people around her and she herself had a ready framework for interpreting physical difficulty that had nothing to do with a heart condition and everything to do with weight. This is not an indictment of any individual. It is a description of how a medical fact was made invisible by a cultural one. The morning after her death, the New York Times ran a short obituary on page 38. It mentioned the ham sandwich. It described her as the hefty member of the Mamas and the Papas. It gave her voice 3 sentences. The Los Angeles Times was similar. So were the wire reports that ran in regional papers across the country. The coverage was not cruel in any deliberate way. It simply continued, in the announcement of her death, the same grammar that had been applied to her life. The body first, the voice as secondary, the fat joke as punctuation. She had known this was how it worked. She had navigated it for the entirety of her public life. The sandwich story was, in a sense, the last thing the machinery did to her, and the most efficient. It converted her death into the same punchline her existence had always been threatened with, and it did it before anyone had time to object. The correction came years later, quietly, in medical journals and retrospective profiles, and the patient efforts of people who knew her. By then, the story had been in the culture for decades. It had done what it needed to do. In 1967, Cass Elliot gave birth to a daughter. She named her Owen Vanessa Elliot. The name Owen was unusual for a girl in that period. Deliberately so, in the way that Cass made many decisions, with a kind of preemptive claim on singularity. The child would not be easily categorized. She would have a name that required a second look. The father's identity was not disclosed publicly. Cass did not name him in interviews, did not reference him in the careful way that public figures reference things they want acknowledged but not examined. She simply declined to provide the information, and when pressed, which she was repeatedly in the manner of the press of that era, she deflected with humor or change the subject with the ease of someone who had been changing subjects in interviews for years. The most commonly cited candidate in the accounts written after her death is James Hendricks, the musician she had performed with in the Big Three in the early 1960s. Hendricks and Cass had remained close after that group dissolved, and they had at some point entered into a marriage of convenience. A legal arrangement entered into so that Cass could obtain a green card. That was not a romantic partnership in any functional sense. Hendricks was, by most accounts, gay. The marriage was a practical solution to an immigration problem, and both parties understood it as such. Whether Hendricks was Owen's biological father is not definitively established in any public record. Cass never confirmed it. Owen Elliot Kugel, speaking publicly about her mother in later decades, has not resolved this question with finality either. It exists in the category of things that Cass kept to herself, not because the information was shameful, but because she had developed, over years of being a public figure whose private life was treated as available for commentary, a specific discipline around what she allowed to be known. What is knowable is the circumstance into which Owen was born. Her mother was 25, famous, earning significant money for the first time in her life, and embedded in a group whose internal dynamics were already fracturing. The Mamas and the Papas were in their commercial peak in 1967, which meant that the demands on Cass's time, recording sessions, promotional appearances, touring, the constant maintenance of public visibility, were at their highest precisely when she had a newborn at home. She did not slow down. The industry did not offer her the option to slow down, and she did not ask for it. There are no accounts of Cass requesting a reduced schedule after Owen's birth, no evidence of negotiations with Dunhill about maternity leave in any form. Such a negotiation would have been essentially unprecedented in the music industry of that period. Female artists who became mothers were expected to manage the fact privately and continue performing publicly, and the management of it was understood to be their problem and no one else's. Cass hired help. She had the money for it now, and she used it. Owen was cared for by a succession of people whose names do not appear in any public record. Cass was present when she was home and absent when she was working, which was most of the time. This is a description of how many parents in demanding professions live, but it carries a different weight when it is the only parent, because Owen had, in practical terms, one parent. Cass was it. Whatever the biological facts of her father's identity, he was not a present figure in Owen's daily life. The child's world was her mother, and her mother's world was the music industry, and these two things coexisted in a household in Laurel Canyon, where famous people came and went, and the phone rang at all hours, and the frenetic social life that Cass maintained, partly out of genuine warmth and partly out of the same need for company that had driven her since childhood, made the house full without necessarily making it stable. Owen would later describe her childhood in terms that were careful and loving toward her mother's memory, but that did not obscure the texture of what it had been. She spoke of her mother's absences not as abandonment, but as the condition of the life, the background hum of a childhood, organized around someone else's career. She spoke of warmth when Cass was present, of a mother who was funny and engaged and genuinely interested in her daughter, and of the specific kind of loneliness that comes from a parent whose attention, when available, is total, and whose absence is therefore felt more acutely for it. This pattern, total presence followed by total absence, was one Cass had learned from her own childhood. The moves between cities, the failing businesses, the father whose warmth was real, but whose reliability was not. She had reproduced something she had not chosen to reproduce, in the way people do with the emotional structures of their early lives. By 1968, the Mamas and the Papas were effectively over. The group's final album, The Papas and the Mamas, was released that year and received poorly. The energy that had animated the earlier records was gone, replaced by the specific exhaustion of people who had been in close quarters under high pressure for 3 years and had run out of things to pretend. John and Michelle's marriage was collapsing. Denny Doherty had withdrawn. The sessions were difficult, and the difficulty was audible in the final product. Cass knew the group was ending. She had watched it ending for months. What she was moving toward was a solo career, which she had been building toward in small ways. Television appearances, guest spots, the careful cultivation of a public persona that existed independently of the group. But what she was also moving toward, in the specific way of someone whose professional structure was dissolving, was a period of uncertainty in which she would be responsible for everything alone. Owen was 1 year old. Her mother was 26, newly single in any meaningful sense, facing the end of the only professional framework she had operated inside since becoming famous, and doing all of it in public, under the same scrutiny that had followed her since 1966. The house in Laurel Canyon was full of people. It was almost always full of people, and Cass moved through it with the same energy she had always brought to rooms, warm, present, performing a version of ease that the people in those rooms accepted because it was so completely rendered. Owen learned to walk in that house. Her mother was there for it, and then away again, and then back. In 1968, Cass Elliot signed a solo deal with Dunhill Records. The terms were reasonable by the standards of the industry at that moment, which is to say they were structured primarily to benefit the label. She received an advance, a production budget, and access to session musicians and arrangers. What she did not receive, and what the contract did not provide for, was creative control in any meaningful sense. The decisions about what she recorded, how it was produced, and how it was marketed were made collaboratively in the way that music industry collaborations worked, which meant they were made by the people with the most leverage, and Cass, despite her fame, was not yet that person. Her first solo album, Dream a Little Dream, was released in 1968. The title track was not new. It was a standard that had been recorded many times before, and Cass's version had actually appeared on the final Mamas and the Papas album, attributed to her alone, which was itself an unusual arrangement that reflected the industry's recognition that she was in transition. The album performed respectably. It did not perform well enough to establish her as a solo act in the way that would have changed her negotiating position with the label. The critical response was warmer than the commercial response, which is a pattern that would persist throughout her solo years. Reviewers consistently noted the quality of her voice, the warmth, the effortlessness, the particular quality of emotional directness that she brought to a lyric. They noted it and then evaluated the surrounding material as insufficient for it, which was accurate and also not entirely the point. The material was what the label had approved. The production choices were what the label had sanctioned. The gap between her voice and the songs it was being asked to carry was a gap that existed because someone with more power than her had decided what kind of artist she was going to be. She was being marketed as a mainstream pop act. This was a legible commercial decision. She had name recognition from the Mamas and the Papas. She had demonstrated television appeal, and the mainstream pop market was larger and more reliable than the rock market that was consuming most of the critical attention in 1968. But it placed her in a category that the serious music press did not take seriously, which meant that the audience most likely to appreciate what she was actually capable of was being directed toward other artists. She made television her primary medium during this period, and she was very good at it. She appeared on The Tonight Show, on variety programs, on specials hosted by other artists who recognized her value as a guest. She was funny and quick and warm on camera in a way that translated directly. The same social intelligence she had always deployed in rooms now working at scale, through a screen, for audiences who had not met her but felt, watching her, that they had. The television appearances generated visibility, but not the kind of visibility that translated into record sales or critical reappraisal. She was becoming with each appearance more firmly established as a personality, a beloved, familiar, warmly regarded presence, and less firmly established as an artist. These two things are not always in opposition, but in her case, the first was actively crowding out the second. The more people liked her on television, the more the industry understood her as a television figure, and the more her recordings were produced to match that understanding. In 1969, she recorded Bubblegum, Lemonade, and Something for Mama, an album whose title communicates the register it was aimed at with some precision. It was produced with a lightness that had nothing to do with lightness as an aesthetic choice, and everything to do with lightness as a market positioning. The album did not perform well. The label was not concerned enough about this to change the approach for the next record. They were concerned enough to give her less production budget. She was aware of the pattern. She spoke about it in interviews with a directness that was unusual for artists in her position. She said in a 1969 conversation with a journalist whose piece appeared in a small music publication that she felt she was being given material that no one expected her to do anything remarkable with, and that the expectation had become self-fulfilling. She said this without apparent bitterness, in the same tone she used for everything, and the journalist noted it and moved on to the next question. During this period, she was also raising Owen alone, maintaining the house in Laurel Canyon that remained a social center for the Canyon community, and managing the specific financial reality of someone who had made significant money and spent it at the rate of someone who had made significant money. She was generous with her home, with her time, with money itself. Friends needed things, and she provided them. The house needed things, and she provided those too. The income from the solo records was not covering the distance between what she earned and what she spent, and she knew it. She also knew, with the precision of someone who had watched the industry operate for years, that the way to generate income, in the short term, was live performance. She had always been a powerful live performer. The voice that sounded effortless on record was, in a room, something else again, and audiences responded to it physically. But live performance in the venues that paid well required a particular kind of act, and the kind of act those venues wanted was not the kind of act the serious music press was interested in covering. Las Vegas was beginning to present itself as an option, not as a dream. She was not someone who had grown up wanting to play the major showrooms of the Strip, but as a practical solution to a practical problem. The money was real. The audiences were large and enthusiastic. The format required exactly the skills she had: performance, warmth, the ability to hold a room through personality as much as through music. She did not move toward Las Vegas immediately. She held the decision at arm's length for a while, turning it over in the particular way of someone who understands that certain choices, once made, define how you are subsequently understood. Owen was 2 years old. The Laurel Canyon house was full. The solo records were not working in the way she needed them to work, and the industry, which had given her less than she deserved for years, was waiting to see what she would do next with the patience of something that does not need to hurry. The first time Cass Elliot performed at a major Las Vegas showroom, she was paid more for a single week than she had earned from any of her solo albums. This is not a minor detail. It is the kind of financial fact that clarifies decisions which might otherwise appear to be artistic compromises, and it reframes the question of what Las Vegas represented. Not a surrender, but a transaction entered into with clear eyes by someone who understood exactly what she was trading and what she was receiving in return. The venue was the Caesars Palace main room. The year was 1971. She headlined for 2 weeks to audiences that were large, enthusiastic, and demographically distinct from the rock audiences that had grown up with the mamas and the papas. These were older crowds, couples on vacation, people who had come to Las Vegas for a particular kind of entertainment and found, in Cass, something that exceeded what they had expected. She was funny. She moved through the show with a confidence that the smaller television appearances had not fully captured. She talked between songs in a way that felt unrehearsed, anecdotes, observations, a kind of running commentary on her own performance that let the audience in without diminishing what she was doing musically. The reviews were strong. Variety, which covered Las Vegas shows with the seriousness it applied to Broadway, called her a natural headliner. The piece noted her comic timing and the quality of her voice and the particular ease with which she inhabited the showroom format, as though she had been doing it for years. She had, in a sense. Every room she had ever been in had been practice for this. Every performance of ease and warmth and unflappable presence had been preparation for an audience that wanted exactly that. But Variety also positioned her in the language it used as a Las Vegas act. This was not neutral. In 1971, to be described as a Las Vegas act was to be placed in a category that the rock press and the serious music criticism of the period actively disdained. Las Vegas was where careers went when their original context had dissolved, where Rat Pack adjacency and mainstream comfort had replaced whatever edge or authenticity the artist had once been associated with. To be good at Las Vegas was, in the critical grammar of that moment, to have given something up. She had not given anything up in any simple sense. Her voice was the same voice. Her instincts were the same instincts. What had changed was the context in which they were being deployed, and context in the music industry is not a neutral variable. It shapes how everything else is received. A voice that had been described in 1966 as one of the defining sounds of a generation was now being described as perfect for the showroom at Caesars. Both descriptions were accurate. The second one narrowed her. She returned to Las Vegas the following year and the year after that. The money remained consistent, and the audiences remained enthusiastic, and the reviews remained strong. And none of this translated into a renewed seriousness of engagement from the labels or the rock press or the industry figures who had the power to reframe how she was understood. She was filing away into a slot that was comfortable and well compensated and professionally terminal in a specific way. She was not failing, which meant no one felt the urgency to do anything differently. During this period, she was also appearing on television with increasing frequency. Not just talk shows, but variety specials, guest spots on sitcoms, the kind of broad entertainment programming that reached the largest possible audience and required the performer to be likable above all else. She was extraordinarily likable. She was so likable that it had become its own kind of limitation. The warmth of her public persona so thoroughly established that there was no longer any expectation that she might do something that complicated it. She recorded The Road Is No Place for a Lady in 1972, an album that represented, in its title and its content, a kind of weariness. The songs were better chosen than on the previous records. There was a care about the material that was audible. And the production, handled by a different arranger than she had worked with before, gave her voice more room. The album did not perform significantly better than its predecessors. The label's promotional investment was modest. It was released into a market that had moved on from her in the specific way markets move on. Not dramatically, not with a clear break, but gradually through a series of small redirections of attention toward newer things. She was 30 years old. The house in Laurel Canyon was still the social center it had always been, but the canyon scene itself was changing. The early 70s brought a different energy, less communal, more fractured. The idealism of the late 60s curdling in the specific ways it tends to curdle when the circumstances that generated it change. Friends had moved away. Some had died. The drug use that had been ambient and relatively unremarked in the late 60s had, for some people in her circle, become something heavier. She was not immune to this atmosphere, though her specific relationship to it is not fully documented in any public record. Owen was 4, then 5, old enough to have a continuous experience of her mother, of the house, of the people in it, of the particular texture of a life in which her mother was the center of gravity for a large and rotating cast of people who needed things, old enough to feel the shape of it even without fully understanding it. Cass had been talking during these years with a manager named Alan Carr about a more substantial reinvention, something that would move her beyond the Las Vegas slot and the stalled solo recording career and into a format that used her more fully. Carr had ideas about her as a theatrical performer, about a show built around her personality and her voice that would have a different kind of ambition than the showroom sets. These conversations were real and serious and went on for some time. They had not produced anything by 1973. By 1974, Cass had taken a different direction. Not toward the theatrical reinvention Carr had been sketching, but toward London, toward the Palladium, toward 2 sold-out nights that the critics would call a triumph, and that she would not live past by more than 4 days. She was still working on what came next. There is a particular kind of surveillance that public figures who do not fit the expected physical template experience, and it operates differently from ordinary scrutiny. It is not intermittent. It does not pause during periods of professional success or personal difficulty. It runs continuously in the background of every public appearance, every interview, every photograph, and it shapes the language through which everything else about the person is perceived and communicated. Cass Elliot lived inside this surveillance for the entirety of her public life, from the first profile written about the mamas and the papas in 1966 until the obituaries printed in July 1974. What follows is not a catalog of cruelties, though cruelties are present. It is an account of how a persistent and collective narrative about a woman's body displaced other narratives that were equally available, and what the consequences of that displacement were. She was 5 feet 5 inches tall. Her weight fluctuated throughout her adult life. She dieted repeatedly, lost significant amounts of weight on several occasions, regained it, and discussed all of this in interviews with a candor that the interviewers received as either brave or confessional, depending on their disposition. The fluctuations were not unusual for someone cycling through the crash diets and appetite suppressants that were standard medical recommendations for overweight women in the 1960s and early 1970s. What was unusual was how publicly they were tracked. In 1967, she lost a reported 40 pounds. The coverage of this weight loss was extensive, more extensive, in several publications than the coverage of the music she was making at the same time. A piece in a women's magazine that year devoted the majority of its column inches to her diet, the specific foods she had eliminated, the exercise regimen she had adopted, and the way she looked now. Her voice was mentioned in the final paragraph. The implicit logic of the piece, that the weight loss was the most significant thing happening in her life and career, was never stated. It did not need to be. John Phillips made jokes about her weight in interviews, not vicious ones, not the kind that would generate a news cycle if said today, but the casual kind, the kind that come from someone who has decided that a person's body is available for public comment, because the public has already decided the same thing. He made these jokes in her presence on at least one documented occasion, during a joint interview that appeared in a music publication in 1967. The interviewer did not challenge this. Cass responded with a joke of her own. The exchange was printed as evidence of the group's easy rapport. Denny Doherty was similarly casual. Michelle Phillips, in her own way, contributed not through jokes, but through the visual contrast that was consistently staged in photographs. The willowy and conventionally beautiful Michelle was positioned near Cass in ways that reinforced the implicit hierarchy of whose body was acceptable and whose required explanation. These were not calculated acts of cruelty. They were the ordinary behavior of people who had absorbed the culture's assessment of Cass's body and acted on it without examining it, because examination was not required. The culture had already done the work. Her doctors throughout this period were giving her medical advice that was inseparable from aesthetic advice. Lose weight. The advice was consistent across multiple physicians and multiple years. It was given presumably with genuine concern for her health. It was also given within a medical culture that systematically attributed to weight conditions that had other causes, and that systematically undertreated or misattributed symptoms in overweight patients. Whether her underlying cardiac condition, the fatty myocardial degeneration that would ultimately kill her, was detected in any of the medical examinations she underwent during these years is not established in any public record. What is established is that she continued to be prescribed appetite suppressants and advised to diet, which is a treatment protocol that addresses appearance and not cardiac function. She had been told in medical offices and in entertainment industry boardrooms, and in magazine profiles and in the casual remarks of her bandmates, that her body was the primary fact about her, and that changing it was the primary task. She had internalized enough of this to spend significant portions of her adult life attempting to change it. She had also, simultaneously, been constructing a public persona built on the apparent acceptance of it. The humor, the ease, the performance of someone who had made peace with being looked at in a particular way. These two things, the internalized pressure and the performed ease, coexisted in her public presentation, in ways that people who knew her well could sometimes detect, and people who knew her only through the media could not. Friends from the Laurel Canyon years describe a woman who could, in private, drop the performance, who talked about her body with frustration and exhaustion rather than the equanimity she projected in interviews, who had tried things that didn't work and been told to try them again, who understood, with the intelligence she brought to everything, that the scrutiny was not going to stop regardless of what she did, and who had not fully made peace with that understanding, even while appearing to have done so. In 1973, she undertook a more serious and medically supervised weight loss program. She lost a significant amount of weight. Accounts vary on the exact figure, but suggest somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds. Her appearance in television appearances from late 1973 and early 1974 is noticeably different from earlier footage. She looks, in these appearances, tired in a way that is distinct from the tiredness of overwork. Her face has a drawn quality. She is thinner and she does not look healthier. This observation is not a medical assessment. It is what is visible in the footage. The people around her at the time who have spoken about this period, musicians she worked with, friends from the canyon, have said in various formulations that they were concerned about her during these months, that she seemed depleted, that the weight loss, which was being celebrated by the industry and the press as a positive development, did not seem to be making her feel better. She continued performing. She continued giving interviews in which she spoke about her health with optimism. She booked the London Palladium engagement for July 1974 and began preparing for it with the same seriousness she had always brought to significant performances. Her heart was doing what it had been doing for years, quietly, without announcement. The engagement at the London Palladium had been in planning for several months before Cass arrived in England in the summer of 1974. 2 nights, July 20th and July 21st, both sold out. The Palladium was not a small room or an easy room. It seated approximately 2,300 people and carried the particular weight of a venue where the history of performance was physically present, where the audience arrived with expectations shaped by everyone who had stood on that stage before. To sell it out twice, as a solo American act in 1974, required a kind of reputation that transcended current chart position or recent critical attention. She had that reputation. Whatever the industry's ambivalence about where to place her, whatever the critical apparatus had decided about Las Vegas and mainstream television and the slot she had been filed into, audiences had not filed her anywhere. They came because they wanted to hear her sing. This is a distinction that the music industry is structurally bad at recognizing, and it matters here because the Palladium engagement was, among other things, evidence of a gap between how Cass was valued commercially and how she was valued by the people who actually paid to see her. She arrived in London in early July and stayed in the Mayfair flat that Harry Nilsson had offered her. Nilsson was a friend, one of the genuine ones from the category of people in her life who were present because they wanted to be and not because they needed something. The flat was comfortable, in a good neighborhood, and she settled into it with the ease of someone who had been traveling and performing for long enough. The temporary homes were a practiced comfort. The rehearsals went well. The musicians she was working with for the London dates, a band assembled for the engagement, spoke afterward about the specificity of her musical direction. She knew what she wanted. She knew where the arrangements needed adjustment and how to describe those adjustments to other musicians in terms they could act on. This had always been true of her, from the earliest sessions with the Mamas and the Papas through the solo years, but it was particularly evident in London, perhaps because the context was new and the musicians did not have prior assumptions about how she worked. July 20th arrived. The Palladium filled. She walked out to an ovation that had not yet heard a note. What followed, by every account available, from reviews, from audience members who later wrote about it, from the musicians on stage with her, was one of the finest performances of her career. She was an extraordinary voice. The warmth that had always been present in her singing was there, and underneath it, something more demanding, a precision and a reach that the Las Vegas sets and the television appearances had not always required of her. She sang songs from across her career, material from the Mamas and the Papas alongside her solo work, and the room received all of it with the focused attention of an audience that understood it was hearing something worth hearing. Between songs, she talked. This was always part of her live performance, and she was better at it than almost anyone working in popular music at that time. She was funny without being a comedian, warm without being ingratiating, self-aware, without turning the self-awareness into a routine. The audience at the Palladium responded to this with the particular pleasure of people who feel they are being spoken to directly rather than performed at. Several audience members who wrote about the night used the same word, independently of each other, to describe their experience: intimate. A room of 2,300 people, and the word they reached for was intimate. The second night, July 21st, was the same. Sold out. Another ovation before she sang. Another performance that the reviews the following morning would describe with the specific register of critics who have been surprised into genuine admiration. The Times of London called her voice an instrument of uncommon beauty. The Guardian noted that she had the rare ability to make a large venue feel small. These were not the reviews of a Las Vegas act or a television personality. These were reviews of a serious musical performer at the height of her powers. She gave interviews after the second show. She was elated, not the performed elation of someone managing their public image, but the specific and less guarded happiness of someone who has done the thing they came to do and knows it went well. A journalist who spoke with her backstage that night wrote that she seemed lighter than she had expected, more present, more openly pleased with herself than the Cass Elliot of prior interviews had generally allowed herself to be. She talked about what came next. She had plans. The London engagement was supposed to be the beginning of something. A European tour, a return to recording, with more creative control than she had previously been given, a reinvention that was more substantial than the ones the industry had offered her, and then withdrawn. She talked about these plans with the specificity of someone who had thought them through, rather than the vagueness of someone describing wishes. The following 4 days were quiet. She rested in the Mayfair flat. Friends visited. She spoke on the phone with Owen, who was in Los Angeles with a caregiver. She ate, slept, recovered from the expenditure of 2 major performances in the way that performers do. The body requiring a period of stillness after the particular intensity of being entirely present for an audience. On July 25th, Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who was also staying in Harry Nilsson's flat at the time, in a separate arrangement, came and went. The building had a particular quality of that moment in rock music, people passing through, connections loose and various. On the morning of July 29th, the housekeeper arrived at the flat and found Cass Elliot in bed. She had died sometime during the night. She was fully clothed. There was no sign of distress. Her heart had simply stopped in the quiet of a Mayfair bedroom, 4 days after the best reviews of her career. She was 32 years old. She had a daughter in Los Angeles who was 6. She had plans that were specific enough to be described in detail to a journalist 8 days before. The housekeeper called for help. Outside, London was going about its mourning. The official record of Cass Elliot's death begins with a call to emergency services on the morning of July 29th, 1974. The housekeeper who made the call had arrived at the Mayfair flat to find her employer unresponsive in bed. The ambulance crew who responded confirmed what the housekeeper had already understood. There was nothing to be done. The body was taken to a nearby hospital where death was formally pronounced, and the process by which a private fact becomes a public one began its ordinary course. Keith Simpson was appointed to conduct the post-mortem examination. Simpson was, at that point in his career, among the most experienced forensic pathologists in Britain, a man whose professional life had been spent establishing facts in circumstances where facts were contested or obscured. He had testified in murder trials, had written extensively on forensic methodology, and brought to the examination of Cass Elliot's body the same systematic attention he brought to every case that came before him. His findings were clear. The cause of death was fatty myocardial degeneration, a condition in which fat infiltrates the muscle tissue of the heart, compromising its ability to contract effectively. It is a condition that develops over time, not acutely. It does not announce itself with dramatic symptoms. It erodes function gradually, and the person carrying it may be aware only of fatigue, occasional breathlessness, a heaviness that is easy to attribute to other causes. In its advanced stages, it can produce death during sleep, without warning, without pain, without any external indication that anything has happened at all. This is what it produced in Cass Elliot's case. There was no food in her airway. There was no alcohol in her system at a level consistent with acute intoxication. There were no drugs present at concentrations that would have contributed to her death. Simpson's report was unambiguous on these points. He was a man who had spent his career being precise about cause and effect in the context of death, and his conclusion was simple. Her heart had given out. The mechanism was medical. The cause was a condition she had been carrying, likely for years, that had not been identified or treated. The report was completed and its findings were made available. They did not travel at the speed of the story that had already been released. The ham sandwich narrative had emerged within hours of her death being reported, before Simpson had completed his examination, before any official cause had been determined, before anyone with relevant authority had said anything definitive about what had happened. It came from somewhere in the chain, between the initial reports and the news desks that received them, and by the time it reached print, it had the confidence of established fact. It named the sandwich. It described its position on the nightstand. It was specific in the way that false stories are often specific. The specificity performing credibility in place of evidence. The correction, when it came, was quiet and poorly distributed. Simpson's actual findings appeared in follow-up coverage that was shorter, positioned less prominently, and received with less appetite than the original story. The architecture of news consumption in 1974. Before corrections culture, before the specific accountability structures that digital media would eventually generate and then largely abandon, meant that the original story and the correction did not reach the same audiences with equal force. The correction was available, it was not pursued. In the days following her death, the response from the music world assembled itself in the particular way of public mourning for figures who were beloved but not quite central, warm, genuine in places, and already moving toward the past tense with a speed that said something about how she had been held in the industry's attention. John Phillips issued a statement. Denny Doherty spoke to reporters. Michelle Phillips, who had her own complicated history with Cass, said the things that are said in such moments. The statements were kind. None of them were specific enough about what she had actually been, what she had contributed, what she had navigated, what it had cost her, to constitute a real accounting. The music press ran retrospectives. They were better than the obituaries in the daily papers, which had led with the sandwich story and the word hefty, and given her voice 3 sentences. The retrospectives noted her talent more fully, acknowledged the mamas and the papas recordings with appropriate seriousness, and gestured toward the solo career as a thing that had not been given its due. They did not examine why it had not been given its due. The structural question about how the industry had positioned her, what it had offered and withheld, how the public narrative about her body had shaped what was commercially possible for her, were not the questions being asked in July 1974. In Los Angeles, Owen Elliot was 6 years old. The specific details of how she learned that her mother had died are not part of the public record. She has not, in her various public statements over the decades, described that particular morning in detail. What she has described is the aftermath, the way the estate was handled, the people who arrived and the decisions that were made, the experience of being a child inside a situation that was being managed by adults with various interests and limited attention for a 6-year-old's grief. Cass had not prepared extensively for the possibility of her own death at 32. Her financial affairs were not in the kind of order that reflects someone who has planned for early death. There were debts, the consequence of the years of generosity, and the gap between income and expenditure that had been present since the early solo years. The estate was not large. The Laurel Canyon house, the catalog rights, the various assets of a career that had generated significant money and retained less of it than it should have. These were the things Owen inherited, along with the more complicated inheritance of her mother's public image. The flat in Mayfair was tidied and vacated. Harry Nilsson's belongings remained. Cass's things were gathered and arrangements were made for their transport. The room where she had died was, within a relatively short time, a room again. The specific quality of a place where something has happened, already beginning to recede into the ordinary. Outside, London continued. The reviews of her Palladium performances remained in the files of the papers that had printed them. The recordings existed on tape and on vinyl. Owen was in Los Angeles. The machinery that had surrounded her in life moved on to what it needed to do next, which was not her. The music industry's response to Cass Elliot's death followed a pattern that is recognizable in retrospect, though it was not recognized as a pattern at the time. It began with genuine feeling. There were people in that industry who had known her well and who were genuinely bereft. And it moved, within weeks, into the commercial processing of grief that the industry performs, with a consistency that suggests it has been practiced often enough to be reflexive. Her back catalog was repackaged. This happened quickly, with the particular speed that catalog repackaging acquires when a death makes an artist newly newsworthy. Dunhill, which held the rights to her solo recordings, issued a compilation within months. The Mamas and the Papas material, held by a different arrangement of rights holders, was similarly repositioned. The compilation sold. Not enormously, not at the level that would have changed the commercial calculus of her career had she been alive to benefit from it, but enough to generate revenue for the labels that had, during her lifetime, given her diminishing promotional budgets and diminishing creative latitude. This is a dynamic that appears repeatedly in the histories of artists whose commercial value was not fully extracted during their lifetimes. Death removes the complications, the negotiations, the creative demands, the personality that must be managed, and leaves the catalog, which is tractable and profitable and does not require anything in return. The artist cannot object to the packaging. She cannot contest the sequencing of the compilation or the image chosen for the cover or the framing of the liner notes. She cannot call her manager and say that this is not how she wants to be presented. The catalog becomes fully available in her death in a way it never was in her life. The framing of the posthumous releases reproduced the grammar that had governed her public image while she was alive. The cover of the primary compilation used a photograph in which she looked warm and approachable and slightly apart from the suggestion of glamour that surrounded the other images from the same period. The liner notes emphasized her personality, the warmth, the humor, the social magnetism, more than her musical contributions. Her harmonic ear, her vocal precision, the specific and demonstrable ways in which her voice had shaped the recordings that were now being sold were described in general terms, if at all. The industry figures who spoke publicly about her in the months following her death were consistent in what they emphasized. She was fun. She was generous. She lit up a room. These things were true, and they were also the things that are easiest to say about someone who is gone, the qualities that require nothing of the speaker, that do not implicate the speaker in any assessment of how she was treated, that produce warmth without accountability. John Phillips, who had more to account for than most in terms of how Cass had been managed within the group, gave an interview in late 1974 in which he spoke about her with apparent feeling. He described her talent as extraordinary. He described their working relationship as one of mutual respect. He did not describe the studio sessions in which her choices had been overridden, or the interviews in which he had made jokes at her expense, or the dynamics that had kept her in the group's subordinate position for 3 years, while her voice was its most distinctive element. He was not asked about these things. The interviewer was not hostile. The occasion was mourning, and mourning has its own protocols. Michelle Phillips's public statements in this period were warmer and somewhat more specific. She spoke about Cass's voice with a precision that suggested she had listened to it carefully and understood what made it unusual. She spoke about the friendship between them, which had its own complicated history given the affair with Denny Doherty and the years of visual contrast that had been staged in photographs. The complication was not referenced, the friendship was. Denny Doherty, who had been the object of Cass's unreturned love for the better part of a decade, said very little publicly in the immediate aftermath. He would speak about her more extensively in later years. In interviews and in the one-man show, he eventually developed that drew on his memories of the group. In those later accounts, he was honest about the dynamic between them, about the fact that she had loved him, and he had not returned it in kind, about the specific cost of that for her, about his own sense of what had been lost. But this honesty came decades after the fact, after his own life had given him the distance to see it clearly. In July 1974, he was quiet. The industry moved on with the briskness it always displays. The charts in August 1974 were occupied by other people. The conversations in the offices of the major labels were about other artists, other projects, other problems to manage. Cass Elliot was a catalog now, a line item in the rights holdings of a company that would itself be reorganized and absorbed, and reorganized again in the decades that followed. Her recordings passing through corporate structures she had never heard of, generating fractions of royalties that flowed to her estate and then to Owen, diminished at each remove by the structures that had been in place since before she signed her first contract. The Laurel Canyon house was sold. The social world she had maintained there, the rotating cast of musicians and friends and people who needed somewhere to be, dispersed in the way that worlds disperse when the person who held them together is gone. Some of those people became famous. Some did not. Some of them spoke about her in interviews over the years with a specificity and gratitude that the industry's official mourning had not produced. They described the house, the food, the conversations, the particular quality of her attention. They described being young and uncertain and finding in her household something that felt like solid ground. These accounts accumulated quietly, outside the official record. They did not change her chart positions or her critical standing, or the way she was filed in the industry's memory. They existed in a different register, the register of what a person actually was to the people who knew her, as opposed to what the industry needed her to be. Owen was 6 years old, and her mother was gone, and the machinery had already moved on to the next thing. The catalog remained. It was earning money for people who had not earned it. Owen Elliot was 6 years old when her mother died. She grew up in Los Angeles in the care of people whose names do not appear in the public record with any consistency. Family members, close friends of Cass's, the informal network of people who step in when someone dies young and leaves a child behind. The specific texture of those years, the daily reality of a childhood organized around an absence that was also a public presence, is something Owen has addressed in interviews over the decades with a care that reflects both genuine feeling and a long practice of managing what is said and what is not. What she inherited was not simple. There was the financial estate, which was modest relative to what Cass's career had generated, and which bore the marks of the years of generosity and the gap between income and expenditure that had characterized her mother's adult life. There were debts, there were catalog rights of uncertain value and complex ownership. The Mamas and the Papas recordings tied up in the rights structures of Dunhill and its successors, the solo material similarly encumbered, the royalty streams attenuated by the layers of corporate restructuring that had occurred and would continue to occur as the labels that held her mother's recordings changed hands across the decades. And there was the image, the public image of Cass Elliot, at the time of her death and for years afterward, was the image the media had constructed and maintained. The fat, funny one, the one who choked on a sandwich, the warm personality who was the least glamorous member of a glamorous group. This was what Owen inherited alongside everything else, not a portrait of her mother, but a caricature, and a caricature that had been in circulation long enough to have acquired the solidity of established fact. She grew up with this. She grew up hearing the sandwich story told as though it were true, seeing her mother referenced in television programs and magazine articles and eventually internet forums with the casual cruelty of people who had not known her and felt no obligation to accuracy. She grew up understanding, at whatever age a child develops this understanding, that the person the public thought her mother was bore a specific and limited relationship to the person her mother had actually been. She became a music manager. This was not an accident. She built a career in the industry that had consumed her mother's life, and she did so with a practical intelligence that suggested she had spent considerable time understanding how that industry worked and how it failed the people inside it. Her clients over the years have included artists whose relationship to the mainstream is complicated in ways that echo, without directly reproducing, the complications her mother navigated. She knows what it costs to be undervalued by an industry that is simultaneously profiting from you. She knows this from the inside of a family history and from the outside of a professional one. She also became the primary custodian of her mother's legacy in the most literal sense. She worked, over years, to correct the record. She gave interviews in which she addressed the sandwich story directly and without ambiguity, stating the medical facts, citing Keith Simpson's findings, naming the actual cause of death with a patience that reflected how many times she had been required to do this. She engaged with journalists and documentarians who were covering her mother's life with a seriousness that she distinguished carefully from those who were treating it as an opportunity for nostalgia or sensationalism. This work was not glamorous. It was the slow labor of someone trying to replace a false story with a true one in a media environment that had limited incentive to prioritize accuracy over the story it already knew. The false story was more entertaining. It fit the narrative that had been in place since 1966. It required no revision of the framework through which Cass Elliot had always been understood. And revision of frameworks is work that media institutions resist with a consistency that is almost structural. There were partial successes. Documentaries produced in the 2000s and 2010s addressed the sandwich myth with varying degrees of thoroughness. Retrospective profiles in music publications began gradually to engage with her musical contributions more substantively. To describe the harmonic architecture of the Mamas and the Papas recordings in terms that acknowledged her specific role in creating them. To situate her solo career within the structural limitations that had constrained it, rather than treating the commercial underperformance as a simple reflection of artistic merit. But the corrections existed alongside the original story, not in place of it. The Internet, which arrived after most of the foundational texts about Cass Elliot had already been written, reproduced both with equal facility. A search for her name in any given year of the digital era would return the sandwich story alongside the corrections, the hefty obituary alongside the retrospective appreciations, the caricature alongside the more careful accounts. The algorithm that surfaced these results had no investment in which was true. Owen has spoken in later interviews about the specific difficulty of loving a parent whose public image is a distortion. She has used measured language in these conversations. She does not perform bitterness or make accusations against specific individuals, though the individuals who contributed to her mother's diminishment are not difficult to identify. She describes the work of legacy restoration as something she considers ongoing, not completed, a responsibility she carries without a clear endpoint. In 2023, she was involved in the production of materials related to the 50th anniversary of her mother's recordings. She has been consistently present at moments when her mother's work is being reassessed or repackaged, ensuring with the professional knowledge she has built over decades that the repackaging is done in ways that serve the music rather than the caricature. She is the same age now that her mother was when the Mamas and the Papas were at their commercial peak. She has spent more years working to restore her mother's reputation than her mother spent being famous. The financial estate has never fully reflected what Cass Elliot's voice contributed to the recordings it generated, the rights structures that were in place when she signed her first contract, and the ways those structures have since been reorganized by corporate transactions she had no part in, have ensured that the money flows where it has always flowed. Owen continues the work. The record is better than it was. It is not yet what it should be. In 1973, a year before Cass Elliot died, the Mamas and the Papas recording of Dream a Little Dream of Me was used in a television commercial. The song had been recorded in 1968, attributed to Cass as a solo performance within a group album, and it had become in the years since its release something that the music industry calls a standard. A recording that exists beyond its original commercial context, that has acquired a life independent of the career that produced it, that gets licensed and reused and placed in new contexts because it does something reliable and useful to the emotional atmosphere of whatever surrounds it. The commercial is not significant in itself. What it represents is the beginning of a long process. The detachment of Cass Elliot's voice from Cass Elliot's biography. The conversion of a specific human instrument into ambient emotional material available for deployment by whoever holds the rights and whoever is willing to pay for them. This process accelerated after her death and has not stopped since. California Dreamin' has been used in films, television programs, and advertisements across 5 decades. It appeared in a Hong Kong action film in 1994 in a sequence that used its warmth as ironic counterpoint to violence. The specific technique of placing a gentle or hopeful piece of music against images of destruction that filmmakers had been using since at least the 1970s. It appeared in a Romanian film in 2007 that used it with more straightforwardness, as a genuine expression of longing for elsewhere. It has appeared in television dramas and comedies in a category of film and television that uses recognizable music from the 1960s as shorthand for a particular kind of nostalgia. The suggestion of a moment when things were simpler, or at least felt that way, which is a suggestion that requires the listener not to think too carefully about what that moment actually contained. Dream a Little Dream has had a similar afterlife, perhaps more extensive. It has been used in romantic comedies and family films and prestige television dramas. It has been covered by dozens of artists across multiple genres: jazz interpretations, orchestral arrangements, acoustic folk versions, electronic remixes that retain the melody while dissolving everything else. Each cover is, in some sense, an acknowledgement of the song's quality, and in another sense, a further detachment of the music from the person who made it definitive. The voice on these recordings, the specific instrument that Cass Elliot spent her life developing and protecting, and negotiating for the right to use on her own terms, and has become, in its posthumous career, something that requires no context. It is warm, it is beautiful, it produces a reliable emotional response in listeners who may know nothing about who she was, what she navigated, what it cost her to make the recordings they are hearing. The warmth is usable precisely because it is separated from its source. A voice that can make you feel something without requiring you to know anything about the person feeling it is an extraordinarily valuable commercial asset. The licensing fees generated by these placements have flowed through the right structures that Owen Elliott Kugel has spent decades attempting to navigate and correct. The amounts are not publicly disclosed in any consistent way. What is known is that the recordings continue to generate revenue, that the voice, separated from the biography, has a commercial life that the biography alone, correctly told, might not have sustained at the same level. The caricature and the detached voice have worked together in a way that the complete human being might not have. This observation is not cynical in the way it might initially appear. It is a description of how the music industry has always operated with deceased artists whose work contains what the industry calls evergreen qualities: the timeless emotional register, the melodic accessibility, the production values that age well. Cass Elliot's recordings have these qualities. Her voice has them in a degree that is unusual even among the significant voices of her era. What the industry has not done with equal consistency is place her in the critical conversation about that era's most significant musical figures. The voices that are cited when serious music writers discuss the defining vocal performances of the 1960s tend to cluster around artists whose image was legible within the era's aesthetic hierarchies: the ethereal folk singers, the raw blues voices, the studied cool of certain jazz performers. Cass Elliot's voice, which was as distinctive and as technically accomplished as any of these, tends to appear in these conversations as an acknowledgement rather than a centerpiece. She is mentioned, she is not examined. The reason for this is not musical. The recordings are available. Anyone who wants to listen carefully to what she is doing harmonically on the Mamas and the Papas albums, or to the specific quality of control and release in her solo vocal performances, can do so. The information is in the sound. The reason she is mentioned rather than examined is that the critical framework through which her work is received was shaped by the same forces that shaped her public image during her lifetime. The same assumptions about whose body is consistent with serious artistry, the same hierarchies of glamour and gravity that placed her always slightly outside the category of artist that gets examined rather than enjoyed. Her voice has outlived this framework in practice, if not in the official critical record. It keeps appearing. It keeps producing the response it has always produced in people who hear it, without the prior assumption that it requires explanation. The filmmakers and music supervisors who license it do so because it works, because something in the quality of it communicates across contexts and decades and changes in musical fashion in a way that most voices do not. She is heard more now, in the aggregate, than she was during her lifetime. The hearing is stripped of context, separated from biography, detached from the specific struggle that produced it. But it is hearing. There is something in this that resists easy interpretation. Not comfort, exactly, not justice, but a persistence that the industry did not plan for and cannot fully control. The voice keeps doing what it does. The recordings do not know what was said about her. They only contain what she made. By any external measure, Cass Elliot had achieved what she set out to achieve. She had left Baltimore with a voice and a need to be heard, and the world had heard her. Millions of people knew her name. Her recordings had reached #1. She had stood on the stage of the London Palladium to a standing ovation and read reviews the next morning that said she had never sounded better. She had made enough money to own a house in Laurel Canyon, to be generous with it, to fill it with people who wanted to be there. She had a daughter she loved. She had genuine friendships, people who knew her in the way that is only possible over years and through difficulty. And yet, the accounting, when done carefully, produces a different picture from the one those facts suggest. She had spent the entirety of her adult professional life negotiating for a position that was never fully granted. The negotiation began in the folk clubs of Greenwich Village, where her voice was used and her presence was tolerated, and it continued through the mamas and the papas, where her voice was essential and her image was managed, and it extended into the solo years, where the label gave her diminishing resources and increasing latitude for the same commercial outcome. And it reached its final form in Las Vegas and on television, where she was valued for exactly the qualities that had always been valued in her: the warmth, the humor, the ability to hold a room. And where the thing she was actually capable of, the musical intelligence and the vocal precision and the harmonic ear that the people who worked with her consistently described as extraordinary, was not the thing being purchased. She had wanted from the beginning to be taken seriously as an artist. Not exclusively. She was genuinely funny and genuinely warm and did not experience these qualities as consolation prizes. But the artistic seriousness was the thing she had never fully secured, and its absence was present in her interviews throughout her career as a recurring note, struck and then covered over, audible to anyone listening for it. The Laurel Canyon house was the most visible expression of what she had built. It was also an expression of the same need that had driven her since high school: the need to construct a room she belonged in, because the rooms that already existed were not quite right. She had done this successfully in the sense that the house was real, and the people in it were real, and the warmth that filled it was genuine. She had also done it at a cost that was financial and physical and difficult to separate from the other costs she had been accumulating. The generosity that defined her social world was not a simple virtue. It was also, in part, a strategy. The most sophisticated version of the strategy she had developed in the folk clubs, where being useful and present and indispensable was the way to stay close to people who might otherwise have left. She fed people and housed people and listened to people and made people feel seen, because she was genuinely good at these things, and because they worked, they kept people near. They made her the center of something, and they did not fill the specific absence that they were, among other things, organized around filling. Denny Doherty had not loved her back. This fact, which she had carried since the early 1960s, had shaped the emotional architecture of her adult life in ways that are visible in retrospect without being reducible to it. She had had relationships after Denny, the marriage of convenience to James Hendricks, other connections less documented, but nothing that the public record shows as a sustained romantic partnership of mutual depth. The people who knew her well have described, in various ways, a woman who was surrounded by people and fundamentally alone in the specific way that people are alone when the particular kind of connection they need is not available. Her body, which the world had made the primary fact about her, was also the site of a private and ongoing struggle that the public performance of ease did not resolve, and the medical advice she received did not address adequately. She had dieted and lost weight and regained it, and been told to diet again across the entirety of her adult life, and the heart condition developing silently throughout this period had never been identified as such. The fatigue she carried in her final years, visible in the footage noted by the people around her, was the condition asserting itself in the only language available to it, and the people around her, and she herself, had a ready framework for interpreting it that had nothing to do with cardiac function. She was 32 when she died. This is young enough that the question of what she might have become is not rhetorical. The London Palladium reviews were real. The plans she described in the backstage interview were specific. The voice was intact and possibly at its peak, the years of experience having added something to it that the earlier recordings, which were themselves extraordinary, did not quite contain. There was a version of the next decade of her life that was available, in which the reinvention she had been working toward came to fruition. in which the creative control she had never been given was finally secured, in which the distance between what the industry valued in her and what she was actually capable of began to close. That version did not occur. What occurred instead was a Tuesday morning in a Mayfair flat, a housekeeper's arrival, a phone call, and the beginning of the posthumous process by which a person becomes a catalog and a caricature, and eventually, if the people who loved them work hard enough and long enough, something closer to the truth. Owen Elliot Kugel has worked hard and long. The record is better than it was. The sandwich story has been corrected in enough places that a careful reader can find the correction. The retrospective appreciations have become more musically serious. The voice keeps appearing in films and television programs and advertisements, doing what it has always done. What it cannot do is tell you what it cost her to make it, what it required, what it was exchanged for, what accumulated in the space between the warmth it projects and the life it came from. The recordings do not contain that. They only contain what she allowed to be heard. The Mayfair flat still exists. It is a building on Curzon Street in the kind of neighborhood that does not change quickly. Old money, quiet streets, the particular permanence of London real estate. People live there now who may not know what happened in one of its rooms in the summer of 1974. The city has continued around it for 50 years without marking the fact. What the record shows is this. A woman with an extraordinary voice spent her adult life in negotiations that should not have been necessary, inside structures that extracted what they needed from her and returned less than they took, surrounded by people who loved her in the ways they were capable of and fell short in ways they did not always examine. She was 32 years old when her heart stopped. She had a daughter who was 6. She had reviews in the morning papers that said she had never sounded better. What the record does not show is harder to name. It does not show what she heard when she listened to the recordings the industry had made of her voice and compared them to what she knew she was capable of. It does not show what it felt like to answer the same questions about her body across hundreds of interviews, to produce the same performance of ease each time, to fold the same wound into the same joke and deliver it to a journalist who would print it as evidence of her good humor. It does not show what she carried in the space between the warmth she gave and the warmth she received. The ham sandwich story still circulates. Not as frequently as it once did. Owen's work, and the work of others who have written carefully about her mother, has made the correction available in ways it was not for the first 2 decades after her death. But it circulates. It is repeated by people who have not looked into it, in the casual way that false stories are repeated when they fit a prior belief closely enough that verification feels unnecessary. It will likely outlive the people currently repeating it. Her voice is in a film playing somewhere right now. It is warm and full, and it does what it has always done to the air around it. The person in the cinema seat hearing it may feel something they cannot immediately name, a particular quality of presence, the sense of being addressed directly rather than performed at, the thing that made audiences at the London Palladium reach for the word intimate. They may not know whose voice it is. They may not know anything about Baltimore or Greenwich Village or Laurel Canyon or a Tuesday morning in Mayfair. The voice does not require them to. This is what remains, and it is not nothing. But it is not the same as what was possible. The complete accounting, the full hearing, the critical attention that matches what the recordings actually contain. That accounting is still in progress. It has been in progress for 50 years. The people doing it are working against the inertia of a story that was set in the first hours after her death and has had half a century to harden. She wanted to be heard. She was, and she wasn't. And the distance between those two things is where she lived. It is where she remains.